Well, it's lovely to be out on such a sunny evening in Edinburgh, but it's a shame that we have to be out tonight protesting against the two-child cap and the rate clause, well more than a year since Alison, my colleague at Westminster, first spotted it in the small print of a Tory budget.
Very glad to see such a huge demonstration today and so many people still coming along 1 year after the rate clause came into force to show their opposition to this vile and despicable policy. The UK government have never been able to justify this policy, and we saw that this week with Esther McVeigh's pathetic attempts to say that the rate clause was somehow double support for women and that gives them some kind of chance to talk about the most appalling and disturbing experience of their life.
As you can see behind me, we're at the very beginning of the All Under One Banner rally. You can obviously hear the pipers behind me as events are about to kick off.
It's time to aim high, look resolutely outwards, and never, ever accept second best. Above all, it's time to believe that we can. We can build that better country we know is possible. And friends, we will.
If you enjoy watching our programmes, please help us to be Scotland's independent broadcaster by signing up to become a Broadcasting Scotland supporter.
Wherever you stand, get the fresh view of what's happening in Scotland with iScot. Celebrate everything about our country with intelligent, in-depth insight from lifestyle, culture to puzzles, and all the opinions you'll need. Whether it's digital or by post, subscribe now to iScot.
Good morning. Our first item of business today is general questions. Our first question is from Annabelle Ewing.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government whether it will provide an update on its view regarding the impact of the UK's departure from the EU.
Cabinet Secretary Michael Russell.
Presiding Officer, the Scottish Government published its assessment of the revised deal yesterday. As I said yesterday, this deal will make Scotland poorer and hit jobs and living standards. This is a worse deal than the one Theresa May negotiated, and a basic trade agreement of the type Boris Johnson wants to negotiate will cost each person in Scotland the equivalent of £1,600 compared with EU membership. Brexit is already having a damaging effect on Scotland. A recent report from the Fraser of Allender Institute highlights that our economy is already around £3 billion smaller than it would have been in the absence of a vote to leave the EU. The damage this deal will do shows why people in Scotland must have the right to choose their own future.
Annabelle Ewing.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for his answer and note with obviously some depression what he has said about the hugely negative impacts of Brexit, with Scottish businesses at a competitive disadvantage and environmental and workers' rights up for the chop and Scotland's voice ignored. Does the Cabinet Secretary agree that Boris Johnson's bad Brexit deal should and will be rejected by the public when they get their chance to have their say?
Cabinet Secretary.
The question of consent is a very crucial one in this regard. We have very strongly expressed our support for the Good Friday Agreement. We absolutely agree that Northern Ireland should have the deal that it wishes to have. But Scotland should be consulted about the deal that we are meant to get, and that is a very bad deal, much worse deal that is happening to Northern Ireland. And of course, there is no provision for consent within this agreement at all. The Northern Ireland Assembly would have consent, and indeed the period of consent, between periods of consent, would be as short as 4 years. Yet the Conservatives here and at Westminster refuse to allow the Scottish people or this Parliament to have a deciding vote on what should happen. That is profoundly anti-democratic, and I believe they will pay the price for that.
Thank you. Question number 2, Claudia Beamish.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government whether it has any plans to support local authorities to report roadkill of protected species such as badgers to the relevant conservation bodies.
Cabinet Secretary Fergus Ewing.
Presiding Officer, the Scottish Government would encourage local authorities to report the roadkill of protected species to conservation bodies where appropriate.
Claudia Beamish.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. It is helpful to conservationists to be able to check badger bodies for signs of illegal activity and to map populations as illegally killed animals can be placed at the roadside to make them seem like roadkill. Is the Scottish Government able to promote or is it involved with any such schemes, such as the one in Aberdeenshire, whereby the local authority uses a location app called What 3 Words to report roadkills and to conservationists? And such schemes, of course, can be highlighted to motorists.
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, I am aware that the conservation group Scottish Badgers collect reports of dead badgers, including those killed on roads, and anyone who finds a dead badger can report it via a form on their website by email. I wasn't aware of the Aberdeenshire project of which Claudia Beamish refers. She has made her point today, and I'm sure I will pass this for the attention of Rosanna Cunningham, who has the portfolio responsibility for dealing with these matters.
Question number 3, Neil Bibby.
To ask the Scottish Government how many primary and secondary school buildings contain asbestos.
Cabinet Secretary John Swinney.
Presiding Officer, this information is not held centrally. Local authorities are required to keep an up-to-date record of the location of asbestos in their school buildings. Health and safety legislation is reserved to the United Kingdom Government. We take the issues of asbestos within schools very seriously and expect local authorities to strictly follow the Health and Safety Executive recommendations on the handling of asbestos.
Neil Bibby.
It is concerning the Deputy First Minister could not tell us how many school buildings contain asbestos. Can I tell the Deputy First Minister that according to information obtained under the Freedom of Information Act, asbestos is present in over 1,600 school buildings? Would the Deputy First Minister agree that there is a strong case for more regular air sampling on the school estate? And would he agree to meet with Clydeside Action on Asbestos, trade unions, my colleague Anna Sawa and I, to discuss what further action can be taken to ensure where asbestos is present, fibre counts are kept at safe levels for children and staff?
Cabinet Secretary.
These are important questions, and of course I'd be happy to meet with Mr Bibby, Mr Sawar and Clydeside Action on Asbestos and the relevant trade unions who have an interest in this matter. In my earlier answer, I made clear that there are very strict requirements under health and safety legislation for the handling of asbestos and its management. That obligation falls upon local authorities who have the statutory duty for the management of the school estate, and I would expect all local authorities to follow all of that requirement to the full. But I'm very happy to meet with the members to discuss this issue further.
Question number 4, Emma Harper.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what the implications would be for Scotland of a border being established in the Irish Sea.
Cabinet Secretary Michael Russell.
Presiding Officer, the Scottish Government fully and unconditionally supports the Good Friday Agreement, as I've already said today, and the maintenance of an invisible border on the island of Ireland. But the new protocol will put Scotland at a competitive disadvantage in relation to Northern Ireland. The UK Government's plans for its future relationship with the EU amounts to a hard Brexit, a very hard Brexit, with Scotland being forced out of the single market and customs union, while Northern Ireland will retain privileged access to the EU market. If the border is created in the Irish Sea as envisaged, there would also be a need to consider infrastructure requirements at Kinryan ports. This would be a matter largely for HMRC, Border Force and the ports themselves. However, Traffic Scotland would have to consider any traffic management requires in the Dumfries and Galloway area once more information on the UK proposals became available.
Emma Harper.
Thank the Cabinet Secretary for the answer. The Cabinet Secretary will be aware that as part of the Scottish Government's Brexit planning, the East Pier in Stranraer is set to become a lorry park to accommodate 350 plus HGVs each day, all because of anticipated delays at the Port of Cairnryan. Does the Cabinet Secretary therefore agree that this potential disruption, which constituents in Stranraer will be forced to put up with, is a direct consequence of this incompetent UK Government? And does he agree that the only way to ensure this scenario does not become reality is to make sure the current Conservative Government is not returned to power?
Cabinet Secretary.
I agree, and I have to say I saw with astonishment the objections in the local press in Dumfries and Galloway from the local MP, Alistair Jack, to what might happen at Stranraer. It is Alistair Jack that is imposing Brexit on the people of Scotland. He should be aware of that. It is NIMBYism in the extreme that we're seeing from him. Now, the reality of the situation here is that a responsible government has to prepare no-deal plans to mitigate the worst impacts as best we can. And of course, we're working with the local resilience partnership in Dumfries and Galloway on the measures to add increased stacking capacity for HEVs at Cairnryan. I have the greatest sympathy for the people of Stranraer who may have to suffer this. They should take this up with their MP, and they have the chance to do so in a very direct way on the 12th of December.
Question number 5, Alison Harris.
To ask the Scottish Government whether it will provide an update on the progress of the expansion to the 1140 hours of funded childcare.
Minister Marie Todd.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The latest Early Learning and Childcare Delivery Progress Report published at the start of October shows that over 46,000 children are accessing expanded hours back in August. That means that 1/3 of 3- and 4-year-olds and eligible 2-year-olds across Scotland are already benefiting from the expanded entitlement. The latest figures also reveal that 214 nurseries have been built, extended or refurbished since March 2018, and in addition to this, another 120 are already in construction. Nationally, over the summer, all indicators progressed either in line or ahead of the forecast national position. This is major progress, and although there is still a lot of work to do, we remain confident that local authorities and their partners will be ready to deliver when the 1140-hour entitlement comes into force next August.
Alison Harris.
I thank the Minister for her update. The revenue funding rates for private and third sector childcare provisions are published and well documented by councils. But those same councils are not required to publish their own rates. This is simply one row for one and another row for another. The Minister has told me on more than one occasion that she will not ask councils to publish this information. Minister, I would like to ask very simply, why?
Minister.
A key aspect of Funding Follows the Child, which is to be introduced in August 2020, is the payment of financially sustainable rates to providers that reflect the cost of delivery and the national policy priorities. Information published in summer 2019 showed that the funding rates for private providers have increased in all local authority areas over the 2 years to August this year. Average rates for the providers for the delivery of 600 hours have increased by 26% over the 2 years. Many local authorities are also paying a higher rate for those providers involved in the 1140 hours, and in some areas the increases have been over 50%. Calculating the cost of providing local authority provision is an altogether different question, given that local authority nurseries are often operating in areas where the market has failed.
Ian Gray.
Thank you. Will the Minister guarantee that all children who defer entry to Primary 1 in 2020 will also benefit from 1140 hours of funded childcare as Parliament instructed just before recess, and when will she bring forward the necessary legislation?
Minister Marie Todd.
As you are aware, Parliament has instructed that we review the deferral automatic entitlement to 1140 hours, and we are working closely, as you would expect, with local authorities to ensure that we can deliver that as soon as is possible.
Question number 6, Tom Arthur.
To ask the Scottish Government how it is supporting the economy in the Renfrewshire South constituency.
Cabinet Secretary Derek Mackay.
The Scottish Government is working to accelerate inclusive economic growth across Scotland and all the communities in Renfrewshire South. The National Economic Action Plan that I launched supports a competitive business environment, including investment in a highly skilled workforce and a diverse economy. A range of investments will continue to be made now and into the future.
Tom Arthur.
Can I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that answer? Along with the Cabinet Secretary Fiona Hislop and Paisley's MSP George Adam, I recently attended the launch of Renfrewshire's new, bold and ambitious economic strategy for the coming decade. Does the Cabinet Secretary share my concerns that this positive collaboration between SNP-led Renfrewshire Council and local partners could be undermined by the Tories' damaging Brexit deal? A deal that Michael Gove admitted to me in committee last week would give businesses in Northern Ireland better access to the 500 million strong EU single market than Scotland would have.
Cabinet Secretary.
Yes, I do agree with that concern, and we're not alone in being concerned about the impact that Brexit will have on the economies across Scotland and not least in Renfrewshire, where there was very positive work with the Council around the economic plan for the area, where the Government as a partner is making the right interventions and investments to help grow our economy in a sustainable way. On the very same day of the launch, of course, the co-chair was a businessman from the Scottish Leather Group who was announcing 100 new jobs in Renfrewshire, who also expressed concern about the threat of Brexit. So when you hear people like Boris Johnson talk about getting Brexit done, what that means is doing in people's jobs across Scotland when we are trying to do so much to grow our economy in a responsible way. So we believe that the best way to stop Brexit is to end Brexit and end this Tory government's term of office.
Question 7, Gordon Lyndhurst.
To ask the Scottish Government how much of the £1.37 million allocated to the Citizens' Assembly of Scotland will be spent on the recruitment of its members.
Cabinet Secretary Michael Russell.
Presiding Officer, following a competitive tendering process, a contract worth £25,000 was awarded to Mark Diffley Consultancy and Research Limited. Recruitment of members has concluded. The Assembly met for the first time on the 26th and 27th of October. Members are being paid a gift of thanks for participating in the Assembly, as well as being supported to attend the Assembly regardless of their geographic location, need for childcare or other caring responsibilities, or other need for support. The total cost of payments to members and conveners, including support and travel and subsistence, is £339,600.
Gordon Lyndhurst.
I thank the Minister for that answer. However, with the Scottish Parliament already costing over £250,000 per day, would it not be better, more democratic and more effective if this SNP government started listening to the Scottish electorate rather than creating yet another costly group to blame for its failed policies?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I regret that curmudgeonly approach to democracy, I have to say. I would encourage Mr Lyndhurst to meet members of the Citizens' Assembly, and I'm sure that the conveners of the Citizens' Assembly would be happy to meet with him. I had the privilege of so doing on Saturday night in Edinburgh, and I was bowled over by their enthusiasm, by their commitment, by their engagement, by their energy about the involvement in Scottish democracy. I think that is to be commended and not condemned, and I think the member might like to consider whether what he has said encourages that or discourages participation in democracy.
Question number 8, Jamie Halker-Johnson.
Thank you. Following funding cuts from the cash-strapped Murray Council, the future of the award-winning Falconry Museum in Forres is under threat. The Falconer is a fantastic example of a local museum, grounded in its community and working to appeal to visitors and local people alike. So can the Cabinet Secretary look into this situation and outline what other funding solutions may be possible to keep the Falconer going as a vital part of Murray's heritage?
Mr Halker-Johnson, so I think you're asking the supplementary before the question. Can I? So, could I ask the Cabinet Secretary, Fiona Hislop, to respond to the initial question?
Can I say that the current council administration in Murray is having to deal with the incompetence of the Conservative-led administration who walked away from leadership, I think, which is only compounded by the incompetence by which the member from the Conservatives, Jamie Halcrow-Johnson, has just asked or not asked his proper question. Can I say that the Scottish Government supports the direct revenue funding of the National Museums of Scotland, National Galleries of Scotland, National Library of Scotland, National Mining Museum of Scotland, Scottish Fisheries, Scottish Maritime Museum and Historic Environment Scotland. The Museums, Galleries Scotland support local and independent and private museums, I think, including the one, and I will try and come on to answering that question, I think it might be helpful, including those administrations.
I'm going to give Mr Halcrow-Johnson a chance to ask the question again.
Well, I've heard it already. I'm quite happy to answer it. I think I'm quite keen for the next question to be asked, so if I can answer the supplementary, I'd be keen to do so. Museums, Galleries Scotland stand ready, and have already proactively contacted Murray Council about the Faulkner Trust. I do share concerns and I understand how important it is to the people of Forres, but I do think it's important that Murray Council make contact with Museums Galleries Scotland, who've already contacted them. Let's try and get a solution that helps the people of Forres and make sure that the heritage of that vital part of our country can be celebrated in a constructive way. They stand ready to support Murray Council. I hope that offer is accepted.
And I will allow Jamie Halcrow-Johnson to ask the end of his supplementary question.
Well, my apologies for being so keen to get an answer from the Cabinet Secretary that I went a little ahead of myself. Unfortunately, despite giving the Cabinet Secretary the second question, I didn't get an answer. And the point is, this is a decision by Murray Council which is being underfunded again and again by this Scottish Government. So can I ask her again, rather than giving a whole list of different examples of areas being sponsored, can she tell me specifically...
Order, please. Let me hear the question. Can she tell me specifically
what she will be able to do to help the Falconer Museum in Murray, which is being underfunded by an SNP council, being underfunded by this SNP government?
Colleagues, can I suggest... I can see people in a lively mood. Can we just hear the questions and then we'll hear the answer from the Cabinet Secretary?
In a constructive way, can I acknowledge that the fair funding of local government is something that we discuss regularly in this chamber, that I have offered Museum Galleries Scotland as the relevant development body to talk to Murray Council, and if the member was really serious about the museum, rather than trying to do the party political point scoring, which he delivered incompetently, perhaps he could encourage all those who are interested to have a constructive dialogue with Museum Galleries Scotland, which is the competent way of carrying out his duties as a responsible MSP.
And Christine Graham.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. On behalf of my constituents and the trustees of Trimonti Museum in Melrose, can I thank the Government for the substantial investment recently announced for the extension of that museum.
Cabinet Secretary.
I'm delighted that my colleague Fergus Ewing was able to announce that funding. And a very important point, I'm delighted that the South of Scotland Enterprise Partnership is taking heritage, culture and tourism really seriously and helping support museums, but recognising the economic contribution that heritage plays to the economic well-being of the members' constituency and the rest of the South of Scotland.
Thank you very much. And that concludes general questions. Now, before we move to First Minister's questions, could I invite members to join me in welcoming to our gallery Linda Scott, the High Commissioner of the Republic of Namibia to the UK. And as this is our First Minister's questions since recess, I would also like to announce to the Chamber that David McGill has been appointed as the Parliament's new Clerk and Chief Executive. David's appointment follows an open competition and selection process involving all of the SPCB members, alongside a senior representative from the National Assembly for Wales. Many of you will already know David as one of our Assistant Chief Executives, and I'm sure you will share the selection panel's view that he will be an outstanding successor to Sir Paul Grice, leading the Parliament through the next few years. Turning to First Minister's questions. Question number 1, Jackson Carlow.
Yesterday, Jeremy Corbyn again declared that he is prepared to grant an independence referendum if he becomes Prime Minister. First Minister, given they're here, given they've given in, would you like to thank the Labour Party personally?
First Minister.
Well, actually, the pact that I'm most interested in this morning is the one I read about in the Times newspaper between Labour and the Tories to help the Liberal Democrats in Ian Blackford's seat. I have to say I'm confident Ian Blackford will see that off without too much difficulty. But I have to say, I think UK Labour's position on an independence referendum is a lot more democratic than Scottish Labour's position. They oppose independence, they don't want another referendum, but they recognise it is down to the people of Scotland to decide that question. That is a basic issue of democracy. Conversely, the position of the Tories and Scottish Labour and the Liberal Democrats appears to be at the very start of an election campaign to say to the Scottish people, we don't care how you vote, we are going to ignore you, however you vote. Why would anybody vote for such a contemptuous attitude? Presiding Officer, the choice for the people of Scotland at this election is clear. It's Brexit, and a bad Brexit at that, with the Tories, or it's stopping Brexit with the SNP and putting the right to choose Scotland's future, the right to choose independence, into the hands of the people of Scotland.
First Minister, I think we can both agree that there's absolutely nothing anyone can do to help the Liberal Democrats, and it'll take more than a spoon, and it'll take more than a, and it'll take more than a spoonful of sugar to swallow anything her leader is offering. But just 2 weeks ago at her party conference, the First Minister said that Jeremy Corbyn shouldn't even pick up the phone if he wasn't prepared to agree to a referendum. Yeah. Now Mr Corbyn has made plain he is indeed happy to concede that referendum. So isn't it obvious to everyone that the First Minister would roll out the red carpet herself in Downing Street so Corbyn could walk into number 10?
First Minister.
You see, I think what has become really obvious to Scotland over the past few years is that whether it's the Tories or Labour, the Westminster system is broken. Yes. And that's why the people of Scotland need the choice of independence, and it's only the SNP that will give the people of Scotland the choice over our own future. I don't want Boris Johnson to be determining the future of Scotland. I want that choice to be the people's choice, and that's what people get if they vote SNP.
Jackson Carlow.
I'm a little puzzled that the First Minister is being so coy here, because, like me, she doesn't rate Mr Corbyn. Only last month she said she was no fan. Worse, she has described him as pitifully ineffective, unreliable and unelectable. So perhaps you can enlighten the Chamber. What is it that first attracted you to the independence referendum supporting Jeremy Corbyn?
First Minister.
Well, I don't know, Presiding Officer, whether this is going to come as a shock to anybody. I'm not sure I'm giving the newspapers or the broadcasters any great exclusive here, but let me nevertheless announce this. I think the leaders of both UK parties are completely and utterly useless. And I don't think they've got Scotland's interests at heart. Absolutely. And that is one of the many reasons why I think Scotland needs to be independent, so that we can be a country at the top table in Europe, so that we can invest Scotland's wealth in our public services and lifting children out of poverty. That's why I think Scotland should be independent, and I'm determined to give the people of Scotland that choice. On December the 12th, if you want to stop Brexit and if you want to take charge of the future of Scotland, then vote SNP. That is the clear and unequivocal message from my party at this election.
Jackson Carlow.
Presiding Officer, this Saturday the First Minister starts her election campaign the only way she knows how, by ignoring the priorities of most people in Scotland, refusing to listen to the majority, and instead addressing yet another SNP independence rally in Glasgow. So the choice is clear. Either Scotland moves forward together and puts the constitutional division of the last few years behind us, or we choose more division, more uncertainty, and the prospect of a Corbyn-Sturgeon alliance dividing us all over again. A vote for Scottish Conservatives is a vote to end the division, get Brexit sorted, and say no to another independence referendum. Isn't that the choice for the people of Scotland?
First Minister.
I can understand why Jackson Carlaw is feeling a little bit irate. I mean, you know, his party has so much confidence, or perhaps so little confidence, in him that they've put the picture of a backbencher on their election letters instead of his. I can understand why he's feeling a little bit sensitive this morning, but I've got... Oh, look at him now! Oh, look! I think I might have touched a bit of a raw nerve there, presiding officer. But, you know, I've got news for Jackson Carlaw. I started my election campaign yesterday. I did it in Stirling. And I did it in Stirling because that is one of the constituencies where my party plans to oust a Tory MSP. So I am looking forward immensely to this election, presiding officer, because everybody across Scotland knows the only way to end the Tory-created Brexit division is to stop Brexit in its tracks. So on December the 12th, people in Scotland have that choice to vote SNP to stop Brexit and to give the people of Scotland the right to choose a better, brighter future as an independent country.
Question number 2, Richard Leonard.
Presiding officer, in 2013, the Scottish Government published its 2020 workforce vision for the NHS. It undertook to make the health service, and I quote, a great place to work. Does the First Minister believe that her government is keeping its commitment to all NHS staff?
First Minister.
I think the NHS is an incredibly difficult place for NHS staff to work. I think that has always been the case, and as we see demand on an NHS rising, that is even more the case now. I was struck by the Audit Scotland report just last week, which recognised that the NHS was seeing and treating more patients than ever before. So I have got nothing but respect and gratitude for everybody who works in our NHS. This government stands by them and will continue to support them. Under this government, we see staffing levels in our National Health Service up by more than 13,000 whole-time equivalents. That's more than a 10% increase. Of course, we pay our NHS staff, many of them, better than they are paid elsewhere in the UK. So we will continue to support our NHS staff because I think each and every one of them has a right to expect nothing less.
Richard Leonard.
Thank you. The First Minister mentioned last week's Audit Commission report, and last week, when publishing her report, the Auditor General said, and I quote her, "The NHS in Scotland is running too hot, with intense pressure on staff." And over the last year, concerns have been raised by professional bodies and trade unions that the NHS workforce is under growing pressure and facing staff burnout. So in view of this, Scottish Labour made freedom of information requests, and these reveal that last year in Scotland, 3.5 million working hours in the NHS were lost to sickness absence caused by stress, anxiety or mental health related reasons. That is a quarter of all sickness hours lost, and that is a rise of over 50% in 4 years. These workers are being let down. So what does the First Minister intend to do about it?
First Minister.
Well, we will continue to support those who work in the NHS. Sickness absence levels in the NHS fluctuate, but they have remained relatively stable in recent years. And, of course, as I said in my original answer, there are many, many more people working in our National Health Service now than was the case when this government took office. We've also seen, and this was also confirmed in the Audit Scotland report, that the health budget has increased by 6% in real terms over the past 10 years. Most of that increase actually has been in the last 5 years. So we will continue in tough times for our NHS. The Scottish NHS is not unique in that regard. We will continue to support our frontline staff in the essential work that they do. And I would point out this to Labour. I mentioned the increase in the NHS budget. If we cast our minds back to the last Scottish election and look at Labour's spending proposal for the NHS, if Labour had been elected and had implemented that proposal, our NHS in this financial year would be £758 million worse off than it is right now. That's the equivalent of 19,000 nurses. So this government will stand by our NHS staff. I'm not sure Labour would have done the same.
Richard Leonard.
Well, this doesn't look very much like standing by NHS staff, does it? NHS workers are the heart of our health service, and they are being badly let down. And in the end, patients suffer too. The treatment time guarantee breached over 230,000 times. Delayed discharges from hospital up 6% last year alone. 20,000 more people left waiting in A&E for over 4 hours. That's up by 17%. Presiding officer, the SNP has been running Scotland's health service for more than 12 years. And today, the human cost for patients and NHS staff is plain to see. First Minister, this health crisis has blown up under your watch. It is your responsibility. So what does Scotland's National Health Service need? Another decade of cuts prescribed by your own blueprint for independence, or the £70 billion of investment in our public services that would result from the election of a Labour government?
First Minister.
Under this government, we've seen significant real terms increases in NHS spending. As I said a couple of answers ago, we've seen a significant rise in the number of people working in our National Health Service. Demand in the Scottish Health Service, as it is in many countries, is rising. But as the Audit Scotland report said just last week, in 2018-19, the number of people seen on time increased for 7 of the 8 standards. That means that the waiting times targets were met for more people in 18-19 than in 17-18. So the work we are doing is leading to the improvements that we need to see in our National Health Service. And I'll go back to the point I made earlier on. Richard Leonard talks about the election of a Labour government. Well, people in Scotland will have the opportunity in a few weeks to make their choice as to how they vote, and I look forward to them making that choice. But had Scotland in 2016 elected a Labour government, the fact of the matter is, and it is a fact because Richard Leonard cannot deny it, the NHS this year would be more than £750 million poorer. Thousands of nurses that it wouldn't be able to afford to employ. That's what would have happened had there been a Labour government. It is only because there is an SNP government in Scotland today that this NHS in Scotland is the best performing anywhere in the UK.
Thank you. We have a few constituency supplementaries. The first from Liz Smith.
May I ask the First Minister what action her government is taking to address the concerns of the oncology team within NHS Tayside regarding the recent controversy over breast cancer treatments, and what assurances will be provided to each patient involved that they will receive full and accurate information about their treatment?
First Minister.
In terms of assurances to patients, assurances have already been provided to patients, and any patient who remains concerned should of course contact their own GP or indeed the NHS board directly. We want to make absolutely clear that patients are given the assurance and the confidence that they require. In terms of the clinicians, obviously it is important that guidance and guidelines and recommendations are followed when it comes to prescribing any drugs and any medication. It is vital that that is the case here. The NHS will continue to discuss this carefully with clinicians. In fact, I understand that the Medical Director of Tayside is currently in discussion with the Royal College of Physicians on how best to proceed, and I'm sure the Health Secretary would be happy to provide any further information.
Jackie Bailey, to be followed by Bob Doris.
First Minister will be aware that NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde reported that the money they were set to receive for winter pressures this year is £1 million. That's less than half of what they received for last year, and they're not the only health board in that position. Given the expectation of a severe winter, ever-increasing A&E admissions, the 4-hour target rate for patients to be treated and discharged getting worse, does she believe that £1 million will be enough to cope with winter pressures in Greater Glasgow and Clyde?
I'm not sure, genuinely not sure, if Jackie Bailey was in the chamber when I think, if memory serves me correctly, Murdo Fraser asked me this question the week before the recess. The money that was announced by the Health Secretary just a couple of weeks ago was the first tranche of the money for winter planning. There is a subsequent tranche that will be announced shortly, so that health boards, Greater Glasgow and Clyde and other health boards across the country have the money that they require to undertake the winter planning that is required to be done.
Bob Doris, to be followed by Rhoda Grant.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. First Minister, a notice has been on display at a GP's practice in Springburn in my constituency, which informs potential new patients that certain drugs are not normally prescribed, including diazepam, temazepam and morphine or any of its alternatives. The notice states it would expect new patients to engage in appropriate withdrawal programmes. I don't doubt the good intentions behind the notice, but concerns have been raised with me that it may deter vulnerable individuals from registering with a GP in the first place. Can I ask the First Minister how the Scottish Government will seek to support GPs' practices to develop a consistent approach which encourages drug users to engage with services in the first place, and to also ensure that appropriate services are widely available to actually support recovery in our communities?
First Minister.
Well, can I thank Bob Doris for raising what is an important issue. I can certainly understand the concerns that he has raised, although I appreciate the very constructive way in which he's done so. I am very clear that integrated authorities and alcohol and drug partnerships must provide services that meet the needs of the resident populations, but also they must do that in a way that doesn't stigmatise those who need support. Prescribers should follow national and local prescribing guidance in prescribing methadone, benzodiazepines and other medicines that might be used to manage people with problematic drug use. All services delivered and all medicines prescribed must be based on clinical need and should be discussed with patients within the context of their long-term recovery.
Rhoda Grant, to be followed by Tom Mason.
The First Minister will be aware of the announcement by CS Wind that it is reducing its workforce in Campbelltown by 3/4. This is a devastating blow for the workforce and also for the whole country, because this is the only manufacturer of wind turbines in Scotland. Can I ask the First Minister what steps she has taken to protect these jobs and assist the workforce in this difficult time?
First Minister.
Can I thank Rhoda Grant for raising the issue? I know this will be an exceptionally difficult time for the workers that have been served redundancy notices at the CS Wind Tower facility in Machrihanish. The Minister for Energy spoke with CS Wind management just a couple of days ago to discuss the reasons behind this decision. We believe that this is about a gap in the order book, not about the future prospects or the long-term sustainability. So the Scottish Government and Highlands and Islands Enterprise are committed to doing all that we can to mitigate the impact of the redundancy notices. Dialogue continues with the company, and any steps that can be taken to support them to ensure the long-term sustainability and success of the company are steps that we are prepared to take.
Tom Mason, to be followed by Jamie Halker-Johnson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I remind colleagues that I'm a councillor in the City of Aberdeen. The First Minister has seen the transformative effect that the new V&A Museum has had on the City of Dundee, a project the Scottish Government rightly agreed to contribute to. However, when the Aberdeen City Council applied for funding for the new Aberdeen Art Gallery, which opens tonight, which has similar potential for the city, that application was turned down. will the First Minister look again at this decision to ensure that Aberdeen gets its fair share and is able to benefit from a thriving artistic community in Aberdeen?
First Minister.
Well, can I thank Tom Mason for raising this issue for two reasons. Firstly, it gives me the opportunity to welcome the new Aberdeen Art Gallery, which is due to reopen on the 2nd of November. I look forward to having the opportunity to visit that. I'm sure it is an absolutely first-class attraction that will be a real credit to the city of Aberdeen. But the second reason is because it gives me the opportunity to address a point that I understand was made at an event last night and has been repeated here in the Chamber by Tom Mason today. So let me just set the record straight on this, Presiding Officer. During the planning or business case phase stages of this, no approach was made by Aberdeen City Council to the Scottish Government, Historic Environment Scotland or to Creative Scotland. Aberdeen City Council did discuss funding with Historic Environment Scotland in 2016 after project works had already begun, but they chose not to pursue an application for funding. So, Presiding Officer, I really do think it's a bit rich to criticise the Scottish Government for not giving funding when the council in question never asked us for funding.
Jamie Halker-Johnson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. It's a lot easier when there's just one question to ask. In August 2018, the maternity services at Dr Grace Hospital in Elgin were downgraded. In November of that year, the Chief Medical Officer Advisory Group reported that NHS Grampian must produce a comprehensive plan and a clear timetable for restoration of these services. It's now certain that that will not be resolved as was pledged by the end of this year, meaning another winter of expectant mothers and their families travelling from Murray to hospitals in Inverness and Aberdeen for vital care. And local campaigners are concerned that the revised timetable to restore services by spring 2020 shows little sign of being met. So can the First Minister tell us why these clear timetables are being missed and what will she do about it?
First Minister.
Well, firstly, thank you to the member for raising what I know is an important issue in that part of Scotland. We want mothers to deliver their babies as close to home as is safely possible. The issues around maternity services at Dr Gray's are issues of patient safety. And those are the issues that have guided decisions up until now, and issues of patient safety will guide decisions from here on. The Health Secretary remains in close contact with the Health Board about the issues around the restoration of those services, but patient safety will continue to be the guiding principle, because I think everybody would understand and expect that to be the case.
And question number 3, Alison Johnson.
Thank you. First Minister, we've grown used to waiting for the SNP government to act on a whole range of issues. We're waiting for the Health and Social Care Workforce Plan. We're waiting for our new state-of-the-art children's hospital to open. We're waiting for a real ban on fox hunting and for an end to the indiscriminate slaughter of Scotland's wildlife on our grouse moors. And we're waiting for your government to start meeting its own climate change targets. Over the last 3 years, the number of homes lost to short-term lets has tripled, making a home an ever more distant prospect for tens of thousands of people in Scotland. So can the First Minister tell me how long we have to wait until her government introduces the controls that are urgently needed to protect our communities?
First Minister.
We'll be setting out our proposals following our consultation later this year, and since this year is beginning to draw to a close, that will be pretty soon.
Alison Johnson.
Thank you. My colleague Andy Whiteman first raised this question with the Government Minister in November 2017, almost 2 years ago. He also amended the planning bill. His amendment to the planning bill offered a way forward. Parliament appeared supportive, but at the last minute, your government sided with the Conservatives to block it and give us a Tory-style planning bill, as the Conservative spokesperson so gleefully described it. Yet again, an SNP government too timid to take action. Here in Edinburgh, short-term lets are out of control. On Skye, 1/5 of all homes is a short-term let, and this is in the midst of a housing crisis. The public are demanding action, Even SNP MSPs who voted against controls are now demanding action. So will the First Minister give us a date when short-term lets will finally be regulated?
First Minister.
Well, I think I addressed the timescale in my earlier answer, but on the rest of her question, I have to say I think that is a complete mischaracterisation. I just think Alison Johnson is wrong in what she's saying. In terms of Andy Whiteman's amendments to the planning bill, he was trying to impose a solution that may well be right for Edinburgh on all parts of the country. And the fact of the matter is we do not see exactly the same pressures in all parts of the country. So we took a view that instead of imposing an inappropriate one-size-fits-all policy, then what it was better to do was allow local authorities to decide whether short-term let control areas are required in their part of the country. That's the kind of devolved decision-making for local authorities that the Greens are usually popping up in this chamber to demand that we do more of.
Thank you. We have some further supplementaries. The first from Liam Kerr.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The power to release prisoners 2 days early exists to avoid the situation of offenders because it's a weekend not being able to access services that are crucial to get them on the road to a law-abiding life. Over the last 3 years, this power has been used just 15 times, despite over 11,000 Friday releases. Now, in November 2016, the First Minister gave an undertaking to my former colleague Douglas Ross that she would look into this. So can the First Minister explain why there have been no improvements since that undertaking?
First Minister.
Well, issues in terms of the release of prisoners should be taken for the right reasons and taken in terms of what's right in terms of reintegration of prisoners into the community. We have a programme of reform of sentencing underway. We want to make sure that the people who should be and deserve to be in prison are in prison, but where other sentences are appropriate, then those sentences are available. And also that in terms of release of prisoners, we take account firstly and most importantly of the interests of victims, but we also recognise that early release on occasion for prisoners is actually in the interests of wider communities because it helps with that reintegration process.
Daniel Johnson, to be followed by Emma Harper.
Thank you. I remind the Chamber of my diagnosis of ADHD. In June 2018, I sent ministers a copy of a letter Grampian Health Board sent to an adult denying them an assessment for ADHD, stating baldly that they did not assess adults as a matter of policy. Despite assurances both made to me and Claire Haughey that this policy would change, on the 23rd of October this year, the Scottish Public Services Ombudsman upheld a complaint against Grampian Health Board for this continued practice. In the report, they stated, "We found that their approach was not in keeping with the relevant clinical guidance or the Scottish Government's mental health strategy." They also required the immediate instatement of an interim regime for assessments. But I'm concerned that this practice is neither confined to this condition or this health board, with reports I have received of this happening elsewhere in Scotland and also for conditions such as autism. So will the First Minister contact Grampian Health Board as a matter of urgency to ensure that those measures are put in place? Will she urgently probe whether other health boards are also carrying out this practice of denying adults assessment? And finally, for me, diagnosis was a vital first step in terms of transforming my life and that of my family. So will she agree that no one should be denied that opportunity by being denied an assessment for ADHD or autism as an adult?
First Minister.
I think the short answer to that question would be yes. I do agree with all of the points that Daniel Johnson has made. I will undertake today to make sure Grampian Health Board is contacted. I would absolutely expect the Health Board to take account of and implement the recommendations that the Ombudsman has made. I'll ask the Health Secretary to look into the wider issues in terms of the practices and approaches of other health boards. And I also agree absolutely that diagnosis is vital to allowing people to take the steps and have the support and treatment they need to live fully with a condition. And I know the Health Secretary would be happy to meet with Daniel Johnson if that was of interest to him to discuss how these issues can be taken forward. But I would thank him for raising what I know is an important issue to him personally, but is a very important issue to many, many people across the country.
Emma Harper, to be followed by Annie Wells.
The First Minister will be aware of reports by Channel 4's dispatches that the UK Government has had a series of meetings with US pharmaceutical firms to discuss raising drug prices as part of a post-Brexit trade deal. Donald Trump famously said that the NHS would be on the table in a trade deal discussions. Will the First Minister do everything in her power to protect our NHS from a Tory sellout?
First Minister.
I think Emma Harper is right to raise this issue. I think there is a real and present... I know the Tories are not particularly bothered about real and present threats to our National Health Service, but I do think there is one. I don't think there is any doubt that if left to their own devices and if they get their way, a Boris Johnson-led government would open up our National Health Service to Donald Trump in the interests of trade deals. We even heard Boris Johnson in the House of Commons yesterday, I think, almost threatened to take control of the NHS away from this Parliament and this government, which I think should alarm people across Scotland. The way to protect our health service, not to magic away all of its problems and challenges, because health services everywhere have challenges, but the way to make sure we can protect our health service, invest in our health service, keep our health service in public hands and ensure that it remains the best performing NHS anywhere in the UK is to continue with the investment and reform that this government is taking forward.
Annie Wells.
First Minister, it's been 4 months since we heard that 1,187 people in Scotland died of drugs. I lost my neighbour, people lost friends, mothers, whole families. And I can't believe I'm saying it, but things are getting even worse. STV News revealed this week that the number of residential rehab beds in Glasgow is down from 52 to just 14. When are we going to stop just talking about this and start acting?
First Minister.
Well, this is a hugely important issue. I do not believe it is the case that we are simply talking and not acting. The government is taking a range of actions, not least increasing funding for alcohol and drug treatment services that can then be used as appropriate to build services in different areas. We've also, of course, established the Drug Death Task Force, which is tasked with coming up with the further steps and solutions that we require to take. The Public Health Minister is overseeing all of this work and remains willing to discuss and to meet with members from across this chamber as collectively we address an issue that must be addressed for the reasons that all of us understand only too well.
Thank you. Question number 4, Stuart McMillan.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister what action the Scottish Government is taking to improve the regulation of the cosmetic surgery industry in Scotland.
First Minister.
Scotland was the first country in the UK back in April 2016 to introduce any form of statutory regulation of cosmetic surgery. As a result of this, an independent clinic providing cosmetic procedures run by a doctor, dentist, nurse, midwife or dental technician is required to be registered and inspected by Healthcare Improvement Scotland. In addition, we have been working with the General Medical Council to introduce a framework for credentialing of medical skills, including a credential in cosmetic surgery in collaboration with the Royal College of Surgeons. That would apply across the UK and we expect that to be approved in the near future.
Stuart McMillan.
I thank the First Minister for that reply. And the First Minister might be aware that I've previously raised the issue of the need for regulation around facial aesthetic procedures on behalf of a concerned constituent and also practitioner. I understand that work on the phase 2 of the regulation of independent clinics is very much underway, but can the First Minister advise me on when these forthcoming regulations will come forward for public consultation?
First Minister.
Well, I recognise that Stuart McMillan has raised this issue before and thank him for doing so. Cosmetic procedures that are provided by non-healthcare professionals within non-regulated sites are currently not subject to the same level of scrutiny as those undertaken by medically qualified healthcare professionals. As Stuart McMillan has observed, this is being addressed in the phase 2 of our work on regulation of independent clinics, which seeks to ensure a similar level of safety and assurance for these sites. The Scottish Cosmetic Interventions Expert Group is currently developing a range of options to regulate this sector, and I can advise Stuart McMillan that it will put forward proposals very soon with a view to holding a public consultation process on the options by the end of this year.
Question number 5, Brian Whittle.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister what action the Scottish Government is taking to encourage the uptake of school meals, especially among children eligible for free school meals.
First Minister.
Access to healthy and nutritious school meals is essential, given the benefits that this provides to pupils' learning as well as to their current and future health. Indeed, this government places such value on school meals that we introduced universal provision for the whole of primary 1 to primary 3, a plan that the Tories actually voted against. And also when Tory changes to tax credits threatened to strip entitlement from 22,000 children in Scotland, we changed the rules to make sure that they would still be able to get a meal. I think that's the fundamental difference between this government and the Tory government. We are always looking for ways to lift children out of poverty. Tory welfare reforms are pushing more and more children into poverty.
Brian Whittle.
You wouldn't believe that there's an election coming up, would you? Presiding officer. Presiding officer. Presiding officer, the topic of food poverty is raised many times in this place, and as we have seen, with much finger-pointing and blame. However, as the recent study has shown, so many Scottish children, up to 40% in some areas, do not take up their free school meal entitlement. We talk about food poverty, yet so much food is thrown out from our schools and hospitals. First Minister, in a country where farmers produce some of the highest quality food in the world, isn't it about time that the Scottish Government had a genuine system-wide approach linking food production, nutrition, food waste, encouraging the uptake of school meals, especially with those eligible for free school meals?
First Minister.
Yes, we do want to encourage the uptake of free school meals. In fact, the latest statistics, which were published just in September, show an increase in the number of pupils registered for free school meals, and I would want to see that continue. But can I say to Brian Whittle, this is nothing to do with an election. This is just pointing out some facts. And one of the problems is the Tories in this chamber get up and say things and demand things of this government and expect us to ignore the actions that their colleagues in Westminster are taking. It is the actions of a Tory government at Westminster that is pushing right now more and more children into poverty, including food poverty. Food bank use is growing in this country because of Tory welfare cuts. That is the first reason why it's a bit rich for Brian Whittle to get up and ask me this kind of question. The second reason is this. We have recognised the importance of free school meals by introducing universal provision for primary 1, 2 and 3. And Brian Whittle would have a lot more credibility asking this question if the Tories hadn't voted against that very policy. So how about thinking about your actions and making sure it matches your rhetoric in future?
And Pauline McNeill. Pauline McNeill.
There are 3,500 families in Glasgow eligible for free school meals, but they're not claiming, and they are amongst the poorest families. So we really have to get to the bottom of why they're not claiming. But the First Minister will be aware that in the delivery plan of the Child Poverty Act, there is a specific commitment to support local authorities to consider automatic payments of benefits. Ministers have supported this concept in the past. I want to ask what progress the Scottish Government has made in supporting local authorities to automate benefits. I realise this is not easy, but I wonder if the First Minister would agree with me that if we can find a way to automate more benefits like free school meals, it will help the poorest children and it will help to tackle poverty in Glasgow and across Scotland.
First Minister.
Yes, I do agree with that general point. I think the more automation there is, then the more we can increase uptake and ensure that people get the benefits they're entitled to. We will continue to work with the DWP and with local authorities to try to make more progress there. But of course, one of the most important things we can do, particularly when we're talking about free school meals, is make provision universal so that we don't have the stigma and where it is easier for young people to uptake that entitlement. And I said in response to Brian Whittle that the latest statistics show an increase in the number of pupils registered. Can I point out, because Pauline McNeill has talked specifically about Glasgow, that increase is partly due to the introduction of universal eligibility to all primary 4 pupils in Glasgow City as a result of action taken by this administration. So we will continue to do what we can to lift children out of poverty. Free school meals is part of that, the new Scottish Child Payment is part of that, but as long as we have one hand tied behind our back because so many welfare decisions are taken by Westminster governments, then we won't be able to make as much progress as we want, which is why the sooner Labour get into the position of joining us in arguing for all welfare policy to be devolved to this Parliament, the better, and perhaps the more credibility they would have in raising these issues.
Question number 6, Monica Lennon.
Thank you. To ask the First Minister what the Scottish Government's response is to the projected £1.8 billion shortfall in NHS funding outlined in the Audit Scotland report, NHS in Scotland 2019.
First Minister.
Well, we did just respond. We actually anticipated this because if Monica Lennon recalls, in the Scottish Government's financial framework for health and social care, which was published last year, the Health Secretary made clear that because demand in our services is rising, which we all recognise, we require reform in our health service to the value of £1.8 billion by 2023-24. That is in addition to the significant investment planned over that period. So Audit Scotland's report simply agrees with that assessment. The Scottish Government continues to follow our twin approach of both investment and reform, further increasing our health investment to a record £14 billion and delivering sustainable improvements to secure better outcomes for those who use health and social care services. Lastly, on investment, as I've already pointed out to Richard Leonard, Labour's spending plans from the last Scottish election would have seen £758 million less funding for our NHS in this year alone, equivalent to 19,000 nurses.
Monica Lennon.
Thank you. I would like to share the First Minister's optimism about her investment plans, but health boards are struggling to break even now. Under her SNP government, the two largest NHS boards, Lothian and Greater Glasgow and Clyde, are predicting deficits of more than £151 million. Does the First Minister accept that these deficits are an indictment of her government's mismanagement of the NHS?
First Minister.
No, I don't. It's because of the investment decisions taken by this government that we have record funding in our health service, funding that would be £758 million lower had Labour had their way. In terms of health boards, we work with health boards to help them manage their financial position. The Health Secretary has introduced more flexibility in how health boards manage their budget, and we will continue to increase funding in our National Health Service. Interestingly, and you know, I stand to be corrected if I'm misremembering this or I've got this wrong in any way, but my memory tells me that at no point over the last few years in the annual budget negotiations have Labour come to Derek Mackay and asked for more money for the National Health Service. So Labour really have to decide where their priorities lie. We know if they were in office, the health service would have less money to spend, and they never, when they have the chance to do so, argue for more money for it.
Miles Briggs.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Record funding which have come from the UK Conservative Government. The First Minister has failed to add. But looking back, looking at the Audit Scotland report, specifically, First Minister, spending on nursing and agency staff and bank staff has soared by more than a fifth under her government. So does the First Minister think this has anything to do with her decision to cut the number of student nurse places while she was Health Secretary, or is it someone else's fault?
First Minister.
For the last number of years, we've increased the number of nurse students, and we have record numbers of staff in our National Health Service. And of course, in an organisation, and I think Miles Briggs should probably think about this, in an organisation the size of the National Health Service, things like nurse banks are absolutely essential to make sure that we have the ability to deliver services. Of course, the biggest challenge on NHS recruitment right now is Brexit. And the Tories should be hanging their heads in shame that they're the ones trying to impose that on Scotland. But given that I've pointed out the implications of Labour's policy for health service budgets, it's only fair that I do the same for the Tories. If we had followed the plans the Tories wanted us to follow when Derek Mackay was setting his budget, if we'd handed those tax cuts to the richest earners in our society, there would be £650 million less in our National Health Service right now. That would be the cost of the Tories, which is why people in Scotland will never trust the Conservatives with the National Health Service.
And Neil Findlay.
First Minister, NHS Lothian is £90 million in debt, impacting on patients. What does the First Minister say to my constituent, a woman who needs an urgent brain operation for excruciating nerve pain, but cannot get it because of the shambles at the Sick Kids Hospital, where the neurological centre is to be located? This woman cannot work, she cannot drive, is reliant on benefits, and lives taking over 48 tablets a day. This is the human face of the scandal at the Sick Kids Hospital. So what are you going to do about it to help my constituent who lives in agony?
Minister.
Firstly, can I say to Neil Findlay, the Health Secretary gave an update to Parliament yesterday on the situation with the sick kids, but I think, and this is an important point, services that are intended to be provided in the new building are being provided on current sites. I don't know the circumstances of the case Neil Findlay raises. I'd be happy to have the Health Secretary look into that. But what we will continue to do for all patients in our National Health Service is not deny the challenges that our health service faces, but continue to make sure that we are investing the sums of money that are required, that we are ensuring the employment of the numbers of staff that are required, that we're undertaking the reforms to our health service that it needs so that it can continue to be the high-performing health service that it is, thanks to the thousands, tens of thousands of staff who work in it day and daily.
Thank you very much, and that concludes. First, point of order, Miles Briggs.
Officer, in her response to Emma Harper, the First Minister failed to outline her links to the Institute for Healthcare. Nicola Sturgeon has hosted lavish dinners for the US-based private health giant at Edinburgh Castle. Since then, private meetings has also resulted in the First Minister and SNP ministers holding more private meetings and the company being awarded a £2 million hospital contract. Through your good office, Presiding Officer, can I ask you how Parliament can hold SNP ministers and their dealings with private companies to account?
Could I thank Mr Briggs for raising that as a point of order. As the member may know, it is up to each individual member here to decide whether or not to make a declaration on any conflict of interest, and I'm sure all members will be aware of that. So that concludes First Minister's questions. We're going to move on now to members' business in the name of Alex Hamilton on
Well, it's lovely to be out on such a sunny evening in Edinburgh, but it's a shame that we have to be out tonight protesting against the two-child cap and the rate clause. Well more than a year since Alison, my colleague at Westminster, first spotted it in the small print of a Tory budget.
Very glad to see such a huge demonstration today and so many people still coming along 1 year after the rate clause came into force to show their opposition to this vile and despicable policy. The UK government have never been able to justify this policy, and we saw that this week with Esther McVeigh's pathetic attempts to say that the rate clause was somehow double support for women and that gives them some kind of chance to talk about the most appalling and disturbing experience of their life.
As you can see behind me, we're at the very beginning of the All Under One Banner rally. You can obviously hear the pipers behind me as events are about to kick off.
It's time to aim high, look resolutely outwards, and never, ever accept second best. Above all, it's time to believe that we can. We can build that better country we know is possible. And friends, we will.
If you enjoy watching our programmes, please help us to be Scotland's independent broadcaster by signing up to become a Broadcasting Scotland supporter.
Wherever you stand, get the fresh view of what's happening in Scotland with iScot. Celebrate everything about our country with intelligent, in-depth insight from lifestyle, culture to puzzles, and all the opinions you'll need. Whether it's digital or by post, subscribe now to iScot.